Exceptionalism is the unifying trait that unites all black males in mathematics and higher education. Hi, my name is Devin Guillory, and for my report, I examine the status of black male engineering students in higher education. Come with me as I take you on a journey to learn about the African American mathematics experience. Exception. Through my research, I was able to determine that exception was a word that best described these black males' experience in mathematics. The reason I chose black males is because they're one of the most at-risk youth groups in terms of education, having extremely high school dropout rates, high rates of incarceration, and very low college graduation rates, and even lower rates of pursuing a STEM field. So I chose upperclassmen majoring in a STEM discipline. I ended up choosing 3 engineers and 1 computer scientist. And as I got their stories, I was able to extrapolate that exception was a feeling that each of them felt profusely and helped to define their experience in mathematics classrooms. The first subject, when I mentioned how does race and mathematics relate, spoke of his elementary school math experience, saying in 1st to 4th grade, he remembered feeling like he was an exception in his math classes because he had always done well in math and was thus placed in the higher tracked math group where he was the only African American male and always felt like he wasn't supposed to be here. He was somehow breaking the norms or the rules dictating what his position was supposed to be in mathematics society. And the only way he could rationalize this was to classify himself as an exception. 2 of the subjects used the exact same word when describing their math experience. Other subjects used the word anomaly when describing how they felt in the classroom. So to break down a deeper story as to how this exception makes sense, I think that exception, they use the word exception or anomaly because they are mathematical thinkers, and as they all said, each one of them had been classified as good in mathematics early in their career. And the use of the words exception and anomaly allow them to make sense of the pattern or laws, which would dictate that they're supposed to be bad in mathematics. And the only reason why they are allowed to succeed or can feel confident in their own ability or somewhat deal with the stereotype threat of being supposed to being in the bottom percentile is by classifying themselves as an exception, as a breaker of the rule, and thus they're no longer bound by said rule. The thinking of exception lends itself to fixed mindset, where 3 of the 4 students had a fixed mindset. And each of the students, when asked about what it takes to acquire success in mathematics, to attain success in mathematics, spoke of it being determined early. So these students had been identified early on in their careers, all through tracking, that they were good math students, that they were math students ahead of the other group. They possessed the potential or the ability, which others didn't possess in a fixed mindset world, to be good at math. This didn't necessarily translate into them loving or liking math, but it did translate into praise and belief in their own ability. So in my paper, I study how this feeling of exceptionality follows these black math students throughout their educational careers. So they feel this in the classroom as being an exception of being the only one or one of a few. and of also noticing the failures of others who look like them in this spectrum. Their establishing of themselves as an exception helps them combat stereotype threat, and somewhat allows them to feel as if even if the stereotype may be true, they may be the outlier or the exception, or not have to face the ramifications of this negative stereotype threat. They all also spoke of the support or the emphasis on mathematics in the community, because there are fewer respective African American males in particular and African Americans in STEM fields or who have taken mathematics in higher education. There's a feeling that there's not an emphasis on math in the African American community. They feel as if there's limited resources, and as they weren't expected to be good in math, and it's something that wasn't pushed. So they feel also alone and an outsider in the community. Even though they're praised for their ability, they're not offered any real support, and it leads to isolation. This translates into study skills. When asking them how they studied, how they worked, or whatever, they broke it down into two different time frames. Because I am talking to upperclassmen, they've had more time in college to get familiar with the new settings and develop new study skills here as opposed to how they came in. But they all spoke about when studying before coming to college, since they were one of a few or the only black students in their class. Even with subject number 2 spoke of, he attended a high school which was 90% black, but in his honors math classes he was still the only black male. And they spoke of they didn't live around nearby or I guess socialize with outside of the schools the people in their math classes. So they were kind of forced to study alone. They couldn't study in a group because they didn't live near anyone who was taking the same courses with them. So this isolated study skills and de-emphasis on group work translated into the college setting. And all of them struggled initially, at least somewhat, with math in the college setting at first. But also interested, this struggling in math also leads right back into stereotype threat, whereas they were the exception at first because they were good, because they didn't struggle, and it was able to help them, encourage them through their math trials. When they did face these struggles, somewhat due to the transition to college, somewhat due to their bad study habits, and somewhat just due to the intensity of the work, the stereotype threat immediately represented itself, and they questioned whether they belonged in the class where they were the only ones of their color, or where it was predominantly Asian and white, and they all mentioned feeling like maybe we don't do this. Maybe it's as opposed to them feeling as the exception to the rule, they re-entered the collective we and were subjugated to this stereotype threat. But so these were the students who, for whatever reason, continued to pursue it even after feeling these reservations in college. And they all talked about now their difference in their study skills from coming here to what they do now. They all stressed group work and how much that helps them not only in understanding, learning the concepts, from being able to voice and communicate with other people and bounce ideas back and forth, but it also helps them deal with the stereotype threat. Because when they're working alone, when they get problems wrong, they attribute it to themselves. They feel like maybe they're not good enough, and that's the reason they're struggling, and it somewhat causes them to shut down. Some even say, you know, when I start getting them wrong, I just give up. But when working in a group, they feel more a part of a collective, and with everyone struggling, they don't see themselves as alone in it, and it really helps them to better understand the math concepts and get better grades and scores. So in conclusion, even though they are still the exceptions in their, when they go to their respective jobs, in their respective classrooms, and if they return to their original communities in their respective communities. I think it's one, help them get to where they are by them by them feeling as if they're above the stereotype threat. Part of the downside to that is that for them to be the exception, there still has to be the rule, which means that black males aren't achieving in mathematics. So part of the ways to combat this are to get rid of the tracking, and to get rid of the tracking to help also to bring more resources into black communities, stress more STEM-related jobs and real practical uses to mathematics, so that these students who, though they've realized they're the exception now, may not always be the exception in the future. And also to, as individuals, they've been able to de-isolate themselves from being the exception through working in groups and talking to other students who deal with some of the same issues with comprehending the subject. But as a collective, they all realize they need to be more visible and active within the black community, to let others know that we in fact do this. Yeah. Thank you.